I was supposed to be on a flight to Portland, heading to my sister's lake house for the holidays. My bag was already checked, my boarding pass in hand. But just as I reached the long-term parking lot, something stopped me cold. I had forgotten the original will. Arthur's will, the real one, not the copy I kept in the desk drawer. I turned the car around thinking I'd be in and out in 5 minutes, but what I walked into was something no mother should ever hear. Not in her own home. Not from her only son. The front door creaked softly when I opened it. I didn't call out. The air inside felt still too still. My keys rested in my palm, but I didn't drop them into the bowl like I always did. Something in my chest went quiet. I stepped into the hallway, shoes brushing against the wood floor. The voices came from the study, low, deliberate, careful. I paused behind the archway back against the wall, barely breathing. "If she's showing signs, we can make the case," said a voice I recognized too well. "Grant, she's 74, another voice replied. "With the right filing, diminished capacity isn't hard to demonstrate, Ashby." That was the name. The lawyer Grant brought around after Arthur passed under the pretense of helping sort out Dad's stuff. My heart thudded slow and heavy. I couldn't see them, but I could feel the shape of their conversation. They were talking about guardianship, about me. Grant continued, "I've already started compiling the list. She's been misplacing things, repeating stories. She barely touched her taxes last year." I wanted to step forward to shout his name, but instead I backed away carefully. I didn't want the floorboards to give me away. Outside, the afternoon sun was warm, but everything in me had gone cold. I got back into my car and sat there staring through the windshield, the keys still in my hand. The woman who had raised him, who had worked night shifts in archives so he could go to college without loans, was now being cataloged like a file in a case. I pressed my lips together, not in anger, in disbelief. That was the moment something inside me shifted. Not shattered, not yet, but the warmth in my chest, what was left of it, started to cool. And you know what the hardest part was. It wasn't what I heard. It was realizing how long I'd ignored what I already knew. If you've ever seen your own child turn into a stranger in your own home, you'll understand what I mean. This was the day I stopped being a mother first and started becoming something else entirely. Let me take you there. I didn't go back to the airport. I didn't call my sister. I just kept driving. My hands stayed steady on the wheel, but my mind floated elsewhere. I passed the turnoff to the interstate and let instinct guide me through old streets I hadn't seen in decades. By the time I stopped the car, I was parked in front of a bakery tucked between a laundromat and a faded barber shop. The awning was new, but the smell drifting through the open door was exactly the same. Cinnamon butter toasted almonds. This was the place Arthur brought me every Sunday, rain or shine, back when we lived in a 2-bedroom apartment off Union Street, back when Grant was still a boy with scraped knees and a mind full of inventions. I walked inside. The counter had been replaced with something sleek and polished, but the tables were still mismatched, each with a little vase of flowers. I ordered a coffee and sat by the window. My fingers curled around the cup, seeking warmth, something to anchor me. My eyes wandered to the sidewalk. People passed by in thick coats, heads down, moving quickly. I remembered Arthur reading the paper at this same table while Grant stacked sugar packets into towers. He used to ask questions about everything, bridges, trains, how elevators worked. He didn't want simple answers. He wanted blueprints, and I gave them to him. I brought home books from the library and circled paragraphs in pencil. I signed him up for robotics camp before he even asked. He was curious, not entitled, at least back then. Somewhere between that boy and the man I overheard this morning, something changed. Not overnight, not suddenly. Like a kettle left too long on the stove. The steam began quietly, then hissed until the room filled with it. I remembered when he insisted on handling Arthur's estate, told me it was too much for me. When he replaced our family accountant with a firm I had never heard of, when he set up automatic payments for my property taxes without asking. I had seen the signs, but I had given him the benefit of the doubt. A tired mother's trust, a widow's hope. Now it all rearranged itself like flipping puzzle pieces that had been forced into place. Suddenly the picture was clear. I left the bakery after finishing half the coffee. The taste lingered bitter on my tongue, not from the beans from memory. Outside, the sky had turned gray. I zipped my coat up to my chin and stood still for a moment. I wasn't ready to go home yet. Not because I was afraid, because I needed to remember who I had been before I started letting others define me. And this quiet detour was the beginning. The parking lot behind the library was mostly empty when I arrived. It was late afternoon, the sky already slipping into the soft gray of early winter. I pulled into the same spot I used to choose when I worked there. Muscle memory, old habits. I sat for a moment watching the branches of the big oak near the back door sway gently in the wind. Inside, everything was quieter than I remembered. The carpets had been replaced, the checkout stations upgraded, but the smell was the same. Ink dust and old wood, a scent that always made me feel calm, capable, whole. I walked straight past the fiction stacks and into the back toward the archives room. It hadn't changed much. Same tall filing cabinets, same beige overhead lights that flickered if you looked at them too long. I nodded at the young woman at the desk and asked if I could review a document I had once cataloged, a copy of my husband's will. She didn't question me, just slid a clipboard forward and pointed me toward the corner table. I found the file without trouble. My hands still knew where to look. The folder was thick, not because of the will itself, but because of Arthur's notes. He had always annotated everything. Margins lined with arrows, dates, abbreviations in his clipped handwriting. It made sense to him, and over the years it had come to make sense to me too. I spread the pages out, carefully scanned each line. The will was intact, nothing crossed out. But what caught my eye were the sticky notes he had left inside the folder. One said Dolores. If you ever feel unsure, the answer is always in the numbers. I turned to the last page. There was a chart, a breakdown of assets, property, investments, bonds. Next to each, a note. D, to retain D or grant if qualified legal hold until independent review. Not grant to manage, not full access for son. Arthur had been precise. He had trusted me. I felt the heat rise in my chest, not from anger, from recognition, from memory, from the sensation of finally slipping back into my own skin. I pulled a notepad from my bag and started making a list. First copies, second legal counsel, third audit of recent account changes. I underlined each one with slow, steady pressure. By the time I stepped out of the library, the sun had dipped below the roof lines. The sky had turned a soft navy blue. The cold air didn't bother me. I walked to the car with purpose. My breath clouded in front of me. And for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel old. I didn't feel confused. I didn't feel like someone being managed. I felt like Dolores Whitaker, the woman who used to organize rare collections, who could recite policy by heart, who once found a lost Revolutionary War letter behind a broken file cabinet, and who would now find her way back through this one document at a time. That morning, I moved slowly, not because my body ached, but because I needed the illusion to be real. I tucked a small voice recorder into the lining of my coat. It was one I used to use during interviews at the library, barely the size of a thumb with a soft click to start recording. I made sure the red light blinked once, then disappeared into the wool. I left the door unlocked. The sun was just high enough to cast shadows across the kitchen floor. I turned off the overhead lights, letting the natural light do its quiet work. I made tea, spilled just a little on the counter, then left the kettle slightly ajar. Subtle messes, the kind that could be mistaken for forgetfulness. By 10:30, Grant arrived. I had not asked him to. He rarely called before showing up these days. He walked in with a grocery bag and that careful smile he used when he wanted something. I sat at the kitchen table in my robe, a crossword half filled in front of me, a pen without a cap. I looked up slowly. He kissed my cheek and commented on how chilly the house felt. I nodded, said I must have forgotten the heat again. He set the bag down and pulled out a container of soup, a loaf of bread, and a tin of crackers. The performance began. He asked how I had been sleeping. I said I wasn't sure then. Changed the subject mid-sentence. I let my hands fumble slightly with the spoon. When he offered to warm the soup, I smiled and said yes, as if he were doing me a favor. Grant moved around the kitchen like someone taking inventory. His eyes scanned the calendar, the pills by the sink, the unopened mail. He commented on a letter from the insurance company. I said I hadn't gotten around to opening it. He offered to go through it for me. I pretended not to hear. After lunch, he leaned against the doorframe and looked at me for a long moment. Then, he said something that confirmed what I already knew. He told me he had been researching care homes, just options, places with gardens, music therapy, staff trained in memory care. He said it softly like it was something kind. I blinked, then smiled, faintly, said it might be nice to have someone else do the cooking. Then I asked him what day it was. He looked satisfied. As he packed up the dishes, I sat quietly staring out the window. The recorder had been running the entire time, every word, every pause, every calculated kindness. After he left, I locked the door and sat down in the study. I took off the coat and placed the recorder gently on the desk. My hands didn't shake. In silence, I replayed the moment in my mind, not out of anger, but precision. Because now I had something more than memory. I had evidence, and the silence once unbearable had become my greatest ally. The next morning, I found Lellen's old number in a yellowed Rolodex tucked behind my cookbook shelf. I hadn't spoken to her in years, not because we drifted apart, but because life folded in on itself after Arthur passed. We had worked together for 15 years at the university library. She was sharp, always one step ahead, and had this way of spotting the flaw in a plan before it unraveled. I called and left a message. My voice was calm, direct. I told her I needed a legal mind I could trust and that it was personal. Within the hour, she texted back. She'd be at my house by 4 o'clock. When she arrived, her presence filled the room without taking it over. She wore a navy wool coat, hair pulled back in a tight knot. She looked like herself, grounded. No pleasantries, no forced smiles. We sat at the kitchen table. I poured chamomile tea into mismatched cups. I slid the recorder and a file across the table to her. No explanations, just quiet. She listened to the recording all the way through. Her expression didn't change. When it ended, she looked at me and said, "We're gonna fix this." She opened her laptop. Her fingers moved fast. She asked about my existing power of attorney and whether it had been updated since Arthur's passing. I said no. She nodded. First thing we'd do was revoke Grant's authority. Then we'd draft a new will, designate a trusted executive, and notify the state of the changes. Everything would be documented and time-stamped. She asked if I had any digital backups. I said no. She told me we'd fix that too. Over the next hour, she outlined a plan. It was clean, quiet, legal. Everything Grant had assumed I'd forgotten I was about to rewrite. Malilin was precise but never cold. She wasn't surprised. She had seen this before. Not with children necessarily, but with those who believed access meant ownership. We moved to the den. She scanned copies of Arthur's annotated will. She helped me set up encrypted cloud storage. She even created a dedicated folder labeled Dolores Legal Private. She explained how to update entries, where to store medical reports, and which versions to retain. Before she left, she placed a single sheet in front of me. It was a formal revocation of power of attorney. My name, his name, the date. I signed it. She slid the paper into her briefcase. Her final words were simple. This is the first step. After she left, I sat by the window watching the bare branches of the dogwood tree sway in the wind. The house was quiet again. But this time it wasn't an empty quiet. It was the sound of something solid being rebuilt. One decision at a time, one document at a time, one version of myself at a time. And I wasn't alone anymore. The days that followed unfolded with quiet precision. Malilin had given me a checklist, but by the second morning, I no longer needed to read it. The rhythm of protecting myself settled into routine, the kind of order I hadn't felt since the early years of archiving, when each document told its own story and my job was simply to preserve it. I began with my medical records. I scheduled an appointment with Dr. Elkins, the same physician I had seen for over a decade. During the visit, I requested a cognitive evaluation, not because I had any doubt, but because I wanted it in writing. Dr. Elkins didn't question me. He ran the assessment, checked my reflexes, reviewed my chart, then handed me a signed letter. Cognitively sound, no signs of impairment. I folded it carefully and slid it into the file folder I now carried in my bag. Back home, I gathered everything I could find that confirmed my mental clarity. Grocery receipts, bank statements with handwritten notes in the margins, emails printed out from the last 2 years. I made lists. I dated each page. I organized them into categories. Legal, medical, personal. I labeled folders the same way I used to label historical collections. Clear, consistent, irrefutable. I scanned every page into my new cloud storage. Malin had walked me through it twice, and now I could do it with my eyes closed. I used a scanner she lent me, small but fast. Each file saved with a timestamp. Each document a small brick in the wall I was building between me and the person Grant thought I had become. In the back of my closet, behind old winter coats and an unused suitcase, I found a box labeled Arthur Mace. Inside were letters. Most were notes from their early marriage years, full of mundane things, grocery lists, quick reminders, little hearts drawn beside his name. But one stood out. It was a single page, handwritten in his bold script, dated 10 years ago. No envelope, just folded into quarters and stuck between 2 travel brochures. It read, "If the day comes when our son makes you doubt yourself, trust your instinct. You've always seen clearer than you believe." I sat on the edge of the bed with the letter in my lap. The house was still. My heart beat steady. The wind outside picked up, brushing against the windows like fingertips. Arthur had known, not the details, but the possibility. He had seen something I wasn't ready to see then. I was ready now. That night, I backed up everything again. I sent copies to Malin and stored a flash drive in the safety deposit box. I added a final note to my journal. There is no such thing as overprepared when someone is trying to erase you, and I slept without turning the hallway light on. For the first time in weeks, I didn't wake up to check the locks. I had done the work, and I was no longer playing defense. I was documenting my survival in my own handwriting in real time. He showed up on a Wednesday. I hadn't heard the car pull in, but the doorbell rang just after noon. I took a slow breath and walked to the door without rushing. When I opened it, Grant stood there holding a paper bag in one hand and a small bouquet of supermarket tulips in the other. He smiled, that same soft expression he used to wear after getting caught sneaking a snack before dinner. I stepped aside and let him in without a word. The tulips were yellow. I thanked him and placed them in the old green vase on the dining room table. He commented on how quiet the house was and said it felt peaceful. I agreed. He unpacked the bag in the kitchen without asking. A container of vegetable soup, a crusty roll of chocolate bar. I offered to heat the soup, but he waved me off and did it himself. He moved through the kitchen like he belonged there. He always had. We sat at the table. He asked how I'd been sleeping. I told him some nights were better than others. He nodded and asked if I'd considered hiring someone to check in once or twice a week. I said it might not be a bad idea. I let my spoon linger in the broth. My hands moved slower than usual. He watched me closely, the way someone watches a dial they've just adjusted. Then he began talking about places he'd looked into. Assisted living communities with wellness programs, walking paths, private rooms. He said it gently, like it was just a suggestion. He said I deserved rest, that it wasn't safe to be alone too much. I looked down, ran my fingers along the edge of the napkin and said I would consider it. His face softened, maybe even with relief. When he offered to drive me to tour one of the places next week, I smiled again and said, perhaps. Then I asked him to remind me what day it was. He told me, and I nodded like I'd forgotten. I let the pause stretch between us. He stayed another half hour, walked through the hallway as if checking for things I might have missed, pointed out a flickering light bulb in the laundry room, mentioned that the porch railing looked loose. I took note of everything he noticed. Before he left, he touched my shoulder gently and said he just wanted the best for me. I placed my hand over his and said I knew. As soon as the door closed behind him, I walked to the back window and watched him sit in his car. He stayed there a while, typing something into his phone. His mouth moved slightly as if rehearsing. I turned and walked into the study. The small recorder in the bookshelf had been running since the moment he arrived. Every sentence, every suggestion, every careful word was now archived. Later that evening, I uploaded the file labeled it Visit Grant Assisted Living Discussion. The performance was nearly perfect, but so was the record. The morning after Grant's visit, I rearranged the living room not because it needed it, but because I wanted to make space under the side table for a second recording device. The placement mattered. He often paced near the window when he was nervous. I tested the angle. The range made sure the microphone would catch any conversation on the porch as well. I left the front door unlocked again, a gesture of openness, vulnerability. Then I moved slowly around the kitchen, deliberately placing little signals of forgetfulness. I left the refrigerator slightly open, set the measuring cup in the sink instead of the cabinet. When I walked past the hallway mirror, I tousled my hair just enough to look like I hadn't noticed. At 10:40, his car pulled in again. He came up the steps humming something. I stepped out onto the porch with a cardigan pulled tightly around my shoulders and asked what brought him back. He said he was in the neighborhood, just checking in. He handed me a new packet from the care center he'd mentioned before. I held it with both hands, let my fingers shake just a little. I didn't open it right away. Instead, I sat on the porch swing and asked him what time it was. He smiled, answered softly, and sat beside me. I glanced down at the folder and whispered that the pictures looked nice. He leaned in, describing the walking paths and the music room like he was selling a vacation home. Then he brought up the paperwork, said he had spoken to someone named Ashby, a legal advisor. He trusted that Ashby could help file the necessary documents. He said he wanted everything in place so there'd be no confusion if something happened. I nodded slowly, kept my eyes on the street. He stepped away to take a phone call. I heard his voice drift in through the open window. He spoke clearly but not loudly. Ashby's name came up again, along with phrases like expedited review and mental competence. He mentioned next week. He said I was close to ready. I sat still, not stiff, not rigid, just quiet. The porch mic caught every word. When he came back, he brought me a cup of tea. I thanked him, asked if we had spoken about this last time. He smiled like he was proud of me for remembering. Then he asked if I wanted to visit the center on Thursday. I said I would think about it. I took a sip of the tea, let it linger on my tongue, and said, "The flavor reminded me of something Arthur used to make." He didn't respond, just nodded, and said he'd call me tomorrow. After he left, I went back inside and carefully disconnected the mic under the porch ledge. I uploaded the new file to the archive folder and labeled it clearly. Later that night, Mlilin came by. She brought her tablet, and we transferred everything to 2 encrypted backups. I showed her the notes Grant had left behind in the care center brochure. He had circled a line in the admissions policy transfer of medical proxy contingent on observed need. She looked at me, then handed me a folder of her own. Inside was a sworn affidavit confirming my current legal and medical capacity, signed by Dr. Elkins and 2 notaries. The game had shifted. Grant believed he was closing in, but I was already documenting his every move, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was not just surviving. I was preparing to be seen. 3 days after Grant's last visit, Mlilin submitted the formal response to Ashby's office. The envelope was heavy with documentation, the affidavit of mental capacity, the newly notarized power of attorney, the updated will, and a written notice declaring all prior authorizations null. Everything was logged, time-stamped, and signed in duplicate. It wasn't a declaration of war. It was a shield. She didn't send it through email. She delivered it in person, a quiet visit to the downtown legal complex where Ashby's firm kept a second-floor office above a dental practice. She left it with the receptionist, asking only that it be placed directly into his hands. Then she walked away. That evening she called me. Her voice was calm, but there was something unreadable beneath it. She said Ashby had called her personally, not long after receiving the file, not to argue, not even to defend his position. He said something strange, that he had reviewed everything carefully and that he would be stepping back from the situation. Then, without prompting, he added that Arthur had once done him a favor during a time when few others would. It wasn't a confession, but it was enough to leave a crack in the wall Grant had built. I sat with that call replaying in my head. I pulled out Arthur's handwritten note again, the one from the old box. I traced the last line with my thumb. The next day, I received a letter by courier. It wasn't from Grant. It was from Ashby. A brief message typed on firm letterhead. He stated that he would no longer be involved in any legal matters pertaining to my estate. Enclosed was a printed record of all documents filed on my behalf in the last 6 months, including those Grant had initiated. The paper trail was thorough dates. Digital logs proposed drafts emails. I spent the afternoon reading each line. There were phrases I recognized from conversations with Grant, sentences repeated word for word. What he said to me over soup had appeared in a draft declaration of concern attached to a guardianship proposal. There were even template pages for future affidavit designed to be filled in by neighbors or friends regarding observed memory issues. He had been preparing a case in silence, and now I had his playbook. I called Malelin. We agreed on the next step. She would prepare a brief statement of intent to be submitted if any further legal motion appeared on Grant's end. A warning, not a threat. That any attempt to bypass my rights would be considered legal overreach and elder coercion. It would go on the record. That night, I placed the letter from Ashby alongside Arthur's note in the drawer of my nightstand. 2 men, one who had tried to erase me quietly, and one who had left just enough light for me to find my way back. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady, like I had finally moved out of a holding pattern and into clear air. The silence in the house didn't press on me anymore. It stood beside me, strong, waiting. Grant arrived without warning. No call, no message, just the crunch of tires on gravel and the slow creak of the front gate. I had been expecting this. The letter from Ashby had shifted something, and I knew he wouldn't wait long to reassert control. I watched from the window as he walked up the path with a folder under his arm. His pace was measured, but his shoulders were tight. The mask of concern was still there, but thinner now, stretched over something sharper. When I opened the door, I didn't greet him with surprise. I simply stepped aside and invited him in. He followed me into the kitchen, commenting on the smell of cinnamon. I had warmed cider on the stove. Let the scent fill the house on purpose. He didn't sit. He placed the folder on the table and remained standing as if waiting for a cue. I poured 2 cups. I handed him one and took my seat across from him. The space between us was clean, almost ceremonial. He started softly mentioning that Ashby had stepped away unexpectedly and that it left things in an unclear place. I nodded. He said he had concerns about certain paperwork being changed without his knowledge. I took a sip of cider. Then I reached into the drawer beside me and pulled out a small stack of papers. They were clean copies, not confrontational, just facts. The new power of attorney, the updated will, the statement from Dr. Elkins, the notarized affidavit of capacity. I slid them across the table one by one. He didn't pick them up. He just stared. I looked at him, then not angry, not afraid, just clear. I said I had made decisions for myself, legal ones, responsible ones. I said I knew exactly what I was doing, and that pretending otherwise would not change that. He didn't respond. His jaw shifted once. His eyes scanned the documents again, then drifted up toward the hallway. I wondered if he was searching for signs, evidence that I had someone else here or that I was bluffing. Then I said something simple. I said, "Not all silence is weakness." He stood still for a moment longer. Then he gathered the papers, placed them back on the table without folding them, and walked to the door. He didn't slam it. He didn't speak again. He left the way he came. After the sound of the engine faded, I returned to the table. I picked up the recorder hidden beneath the napkin holder and stopped the recording. The file name was already in my head. Quiet confrontation, full clarity. That night, I didn't dream of Grant's childhood or Arthur's voice or legal phrases echoing down courthouse halls. I dreamt of a room filled with order-labeled boxes, clean ledgers, a window open to crisp air. For the first time in years, my decisions belonged to me alone, and that was enough. The silence that had wrapped itself around the house for weeks began to change not with noise, but with presence. Mullen's daughter Tessa arrived just after noon on a bright Saturday. She had a canvas duffel, a laptop bag, and an easy way of moving through the hallway as if it had always belonged to her. She wasn't loud. She didn't ask too many questions. She sat up in the small guest room with quiet confidence, plugging in her hard drive, organizing her textbooks, stacking binders beside the nightstand. Tessa was studying archival science, and she already spoke in that calm, deliberate cadence that reminded me of my years at the university. By evening, the house felt different. She offered to make tea and stood in my kitchen like it was her own. She hummed while she waited for the kettle. Nothing dramatic. Just the tune of a folk song I hadn't heard in decades. The scent of lemon verbena drifted through the hallway. That night, I heard her typing from down the hall. Not fast, not frantic, steady. The sound reminded me of Arthur's old typewriter, the one he kept in the basement, long after word processors had taken over. There was something anchoring about it. Over the next few days, Tessa became part of the rhythm. She took out the trash without being asked. She printed labels for some of my old photo albums. She asked if she could digitize the notebooks I had used during my years at the library. She treated everything with care, and she never tried to impress. She simply did the work. I handed over the legal folder to her on the third day. Not the originals, but clean copies of everything: the medical affidavit, the POA, the revised will, and the audio transcripts. She stored them on an encrypted drive, added backup protocols, and uploaded them into a university-grade secure cloud. Grant called that night. I saw his name on the screen, but I let it ring. No message. Later, Tessa sat at the dining table with her laptop and asked if I wanted to label the boxes in the garage together the next morning. I said yes. It felt like saying yes to something larger than cardboard and tape. It felt like saying yes to motion to life beyond defense. The rooms no longer echoed when I walked through them. The kitchen had fingerprints again. The floors needed sweeping more often, and I liked it. I wrote in my journal that night just a single sentence. The house is no longer quiet, and neither am I. The morning air had shifted. The trees outside the window rustled with a quiet confidence, like they knew something was over and something else had begun. I sat at my desk with my journal open, the same one I had been writing in since Arthur passed. The pages had grown thicker, not just with words, but with clarity. I thought about how far I had come, not in miles, not in achievements that could be counted, but in the slow, deliberate walk back to myself. There had been no shouting, no final slam of a door, just the gathering of small decisions stacked like stones on a path I carved alone. I turned to the last page. The ink moved steadily as I wrote. Let him speak first, then watch him fall. I closed the journal, placed it in the drawer beside Arthur's letter, and tucked the key into the pocket of my sweater. The kitchen was warm. Tessa had left early for campus, but her teacup still sat by the sink, the steam gone, but the memory there. I walked through the house slowly. My hands trailed the walls. The photos were back in place. The rug by the front door had a fold where her backpack had been dropped too many times. The lamp in the hallway flickered once, then settled into its glow. Outside, the wind pushed against the glass gently. I stood at the window and watched the leaves turn over, gold on one side, fading green on the other. There was no announcement, no audience, but I knew something had ended. Not my story, just the part where I waited for someone else to decide how it should unfold. And that was enough. If this story stayed with you, maybe it's because somewhere deep down you felt that silence too. The kind that's not weakness, but survival. If you've ever been overlooked, dismissed, or made to doubt your own voice, I hope this reminded you that dignity doesn't need permission. You're not alone in your quiet strength, and you never were. If this moved you, I'd love for you to share your thoughts or simply carry this story with you a little while longer.